This moment started with a slap and ended with history. Outside the courthouse, officers crossed a line. A young black woman had barely spoken when uniformed officers lashed out, their hands leaving more than just bruises. They left humiliation. The crowd gasped, cameras flashed, and whispers raced through the air. But what no one knew, not even the officers, was that in mere moments the entire courtroom would be turned upside down. But seconds later, the woman they humiliated did the unthinkable. She didn't fight back in the streets. She walked straight into the courtroom and changed everything. The sound came like a gunshot, sharp and unmistakable. Naomi Carter's head jerked sideways as the sting of the officer's hand spread across her cheek. The world around her seemed to freeze. The bustling steps of the courthouse, usually echoing with the chatter of lawyers, defendants, clerks, and reporters, turned eerily silent. Naomi slowly raised her eyes, her hand instinctively brushing the side of her face. The officer, a tall man with pale skin and a jaw clenched tight, stared back at her, his chest heaving with the arrogance of someone who thought the badge pinned to his chest gave him unlimited authority. His partner, standing just behind him, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The bystanders were divided. A few gasped in horror. Others exchanged uneasy glances, silently debating whether to intervene or simply watch. Some of them, lawyers clutching their briefcases, a few jurors summoned for duty, and even a young woman holding her child, stood rooted in place, as if the courthouse steps had become a theater stage and they were unwilling, perhaps afraid. Naomi Carter wasn't a stranger to humiliation. Life had often placed her in the path of people who thought they were stronger, richer, or more entitled. But this moment was different. This wasn't just an insult to her pride. It was an attack on her dignity, committed in the very shadow of the institution meant to uphold justice. Her lips trembled, but not from fear. She looked straight into the officer's eyes, and though her cheek burned red, her gaze was steady, sharp, even, like a blade pressed against glass. "Are you finished?" she asked, her voice low but clear enough for everyone within earshot. The officer smirked. "Watch your tone," he barked, his voice dripping with condescension. "This isn't your street corner. This is a courthouse." Naomi straightened, shoulders squared, and for the first time the crowd noticed the way she carried herself. She wasn't a woman beaten down, nor someone accustomed to backing away. There was something regal in her posture, a quiet command that demanded attention. "You're right," Naomi replied. "This is a courthouse, which means justice belongs here, not brutality." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The second officer shifted again, his discomfort growing, but he kept silent, his eyes darting nervously between Naomi and the people gathering around them. A young law student in the crowd whispered to his classmate, "She's not scared at all." The officer who had slapped her stepped forward, puffing his chest, trying to reclaim the power that seemed to be slipping from him. "One more word out of you, and I'll have you arrested for contempt." Naomi tilted her head, her lips curving into a half-smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Funny," she said. "That's exactly what I was about to say to you." The crowd gasped. For the first time, doubt flickered across the officer's face. Among the onlookers stood Daniel Rhodes, a journalist who had been covering a routine financial fraud case scheduled inside that very courthouse. He hadn't expected drama to unfold on the steps before the hearing even began. He scribbled in his notepad, but even as he did, he realized no words could capture the sheer gravity of the moment. The way the officer's hand had cracked against Naomi's face, the way she refused to crumble, and the way the crowd leaned closer, not to interfere, but because some unexplainable force compelled them to witness what came next. Daniel wasn't sure who Naomi Carter was, but something told him this wasn't the last time he'd hear her name. Minutes later, she didn't raise her voice or demand retribution. Instead, she adjusted the strap of her modest leather bag and walked toward the courthouse doors. The people parted for her without a word. It wasn't out of pity nor out of fear. It was something closer to reverence. As Naomi stepped inside the courthouse, the echo of her heels against the marble floor carried like a drumbeat, sharp and steady. The air inside was cooler, heavy with the scent of polished wood and paper. Court clerks bustled about, lawyers shuffled documents, and security guards scanned the crowd with disinterested eyes. But as Naomi passed, Conversations seemed to pause, as though invisible ripples of the confrontation outside followed her through the hallways. To most people there, Naomi looked like just another citizen, a woman with dark, expressive eyes, her hair tied neatly back, and her clothes plain but clean. She was in her mid-30s, unassuming in presence, yet undeniably magnetic when she stood her ground. But those who truly knew Naomi would tell a different story. They would tell you she had once been a law student with the sharpest mind in her class, a woman who had dreamed of becoming a judge. They would tell you how she worked 2 jobs to afford her tuition, only for life's cruel turns to strip her of the path she had fought so hard to carve. They would tell you about her resilience, about how she carried herself with dignity even when life tried to bury her in indignity. None of that was visible to the strangers who had watched her get slapped. But they had seen enough to sense that Naomi Carter was no ordinary woman. Inside courtroom 3B, Judge Richard Hawthorne adjusted his robe as he prepared to preside over a routine docket. His silver hair gleamed under the lights, and his deep-set eyes carried the weight of decades of judgments. Known for his stern demeanor and sharp wit, Judge Hawthorne commanded respect the moment he entered the room. Naomi took a seat at the back, her cheeks still red from the confrontation, though she showed no sign of pain. She placed her bag on her lap and folded her hands over it, her posture calm, as if she had been here many times before. The bailiff called the first case, and proceedings began. But Naomi's presence didn't go unnoticed. Lawyers glanced back at her curiously. Court clerks exchanged whispers. Even Judge Hawthorne's eyes flickered briefly in her direction before settling back on his notes. To everyone else, Naomi was just a spectator. But destiny had already begun weaving threads that would soon place her at the very center of this courtroom, in a position no one could have imagined. As the second case was being heard, Naomi felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. She turned to see an older woman with kind eyes and a stack of documents in her hands. "Excuse me," the woman whispered, her tone hushed. "You're Naomi Carter, aren't you?" Naomi blinked in surprise. "Yes, do I know you?" The woman smiled softly. "Not personally, but I've heard of you. I knew your professor, Dr. Ellison. He used to say you were one of the brightest students he'd ever taught. I never expected to see you here." Naomi's chest tightened at the mention of her old mentor. Memories of late nights in the library, heated debates in class, and dreams of sitting on a judge's bench one day came rushing back. She forced a small smile. "Life has its detours," she replied quietly. The woman nodded, her expression sympathetic, before turning back to her paperwork. But Naomi's heart was no longer calm. The past she had buried was stirring, and with it came something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: possibility. The docket continued. Routine cases, traffic violations, small disputes. But Naomi's mind was elsewhere. Replaying the slap outside, the look in the officer's eyes, the way the crowd had hung on her every word. She hadn't planned on becoming the center of attention. She certainly hadn't planned on standing against men who wore badges. But in that moment outside, she had felt something awaken in her. Something she thought she had lost when she left law school. Her voice, and she wasn't ready to let it fall silent again. Naomi's eyes lifted toward the judge's bench. She studied the way Judge Hawthorne leaned forward when he listened, the way he pressed his lips when lawyers stumbled, the way his gavel tapped lightly when silence was needed. Her fingers curled slightly against her lap. She could almost imagine herself there, not as a spectator, not as a victim, but as the one who commanded the room. It was absurd, impossible, and yet the thought refused to leave her mind. What Naomi didn't know was that fate was already arranging the pieces, and sooner than she realized, the impossible would become reality. The murmur of papers, the shuffle of shoes, the drone of lawyers reciting statutes. These were the familiar sounds of courtroom 3B. But to Naomi Carter, sitting quietly in the back row, they all seemed distant, muffled, as if she were listening through glass. Her mind wasn't on the traffic disputes or small claims unfolding at the front. It was still on the sting of the slap outside the courthouse. That sting had awakened something. Every time Naomi closed her eyes, she didn't just see the officer's hand. She saw the faces of the people who had witnessed it. Their wide eyes, their parted lips, the way their gazes had locked on her as though she were the one holding authority. They had expected her to crumble. But instead, she had stood tall. And for a fleeting moment, she had felt as if the ground itself shifted in recognition. Naomi straightened in her chair, breathing deeply. She was not just a spectator in this courtroom. She was waiting for something, though she couldn't yet put a name to it. At the bench, Judge Richard Hawthorne continued his work, but his mind was distracted. He had noticed Naomi when she entered. Something about her composure, her presence, had lodged itself in his awareness. He didn't know who she was, but he had been on the bench long enough to recognize when someone carried more weight than their appearance suggested. As another lawyer fumbled through a case summary, Judge Hawthorne's eyes flicked to the back of the room. Naomi sat motionless but not passive. She was studying everything, the lawyers, the clerks, the rhythm of the proceedings, with the sharp attention of someone who understood the rules of the room. It unsettled him, though he couldn't explain why. "Next case," the bailiff called. Two officers escorted in a man in handcuffs, a young father. Barely in his 30s, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes full of desperation. His charges were minor, trespassing on a property dispute. But the way the prosecutor spoke, layering accusation upon accusation, one would think he had committed a violent crime. Naomi leaned forward, watching. She recognized the imbalance instantly. The prosecutor was using jargon the man clearly didn't understand. His public defender, fresh-faced and nervous, barely opened his mouth. It was the kind of case Naomi had studied back in law school, the kind that exposed the cracks in the justice system, where those with no resources were at the mercy of polished rhetoric. Her chest tightened. Every instinct in her screamed to rise, to intervene, to speak for the man who had no voice. But she remained still. She had no authority here. No badge, no robe, no power. She was only a woman in the audience, and yet her knuckles whitened against the strap of her bag. When the prosecutor mocked the defendant's carelessness in front of his children, Naomi's lips parted as if she might interrupt. But she forced herself to remain silent. Still, Judge Hawthorne noticed. Her eyes, blazing with a fire that was hard to ignore, made him shift slightly in his seat. For a moment, he almost expected her to speak. The case ended predictably. The man fined more than he could afford, his future darkened by a stain on his record. Naomi exhaled slowly, her jaw tightening. This system, she thought, wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, and that was the problem. By midday, the courtroom had thinned. Cases trickled on, some dull, some heated. Naomi tried to keep her composure, but her focus was interrupted when the doors slammed open. The same officer who had slapped her outside stormed into the courtroom. His face was flushed, his eyes burning with indignation. His partner trailed behind him nervously, whispering caution, but the man wouldn't listen. "Your Honor," the officer barked, his voice loud enough to halt the proceedings. "This woman assaulted me on the courthouse steps." Gasps erupted. Heads turned toward Naomi. Naomi's body stiffened. She hadn't laid a finger on him, and everyone outside knew it. But his accusation carried the weight of a badge, and that was often enough. Judge Hawthorne raised his gavel sharply. "Order!" he commanded. His eyes narrowed at the officer. "Who is this about?" The officer jabbed a finger toward the back of the room. Her. That woman. All eyes landed on Naomi. She stood slowly, not shrinking, but standing as if she had rehearsed this very moment in her mind. "That's a lie," she said firmly, her voice carrying across the courtroom. The officer scoffed. "You calling me a liar in front of a judge?" Naomi's eyes didn't waver. "I'm calling you what you are." The courtroom buzzed. Judge Hawthorne rapped his gavel again, silencing the whispers. He studied Naomi carefully, then turned his gaze on the officer. Something about his demeanor troubled him, the arrogance, the lack of professionalism. He had seen this type before, but it wasn't the officer's outburst that unsettled him most. It was Naomi's response, calm, unshaken, as though she was not the accused but the authority. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward, his deep voice deliberate. "Miss Carter, is it?" Naomi blinked. "Yes, Your Honor." You seem to know how to hold yourself in this room. Do you have legal training? The question caught everyone off guard. Lawyers exchanged glances. The bailiff arched a brow. Even Naomi hesitated. Finally, she nodded. I studied law, she admitted softly. I didn't finish. But yes, I know this room. Judge Hawthorne's eyes sharpened. And yet you stand here accused by an officer of assault. Do you have any witnesses? Naomi glanced around. Several people from outside, bystanders who had seen the slap, were seated in the audience. Slowly, a young woman raised her hand. I saw everything, Your Honor. She didn't touch him. He slapped her, another voice chimed in. Then another. Soon, half a dozen murmured their agreement. The officer paled. Judge Hawthorne tapped his gavel. Enough. This is not the place for theatrics. He turned to Naomi again. But it seems you've gathered witnesses without trying. That says something. Naomi tilted her head. Uncertain if his tone was rebuke or acknowledgement, then came the question no one expected. Tell me, Miss Carter, Judge Hawthorne said slowly, if you were in my seat right now, how would you handle this officer's accusation? The courtroom went silent. Naomi's pulse quickened. Every eye bore into her. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders, but she didn't flinch. I would demand evidence, she said clearly. I would weigh testimony from all sides. And I would remind this courtroom that justice doesn't belong to badges or uniforms. It belongs to truth. The silence deepened. Then, to everyone's shock, Judge Hawthorne leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Not a bad answer, he murmured. Word of the exchange spread quickly. Court clerks whispered in hallways. Lawyers muttered over coffee. Even the bailiff shook his head in disbelief. Who was this woman? And why had Judge Hawthorne, a man notorious for his iron authority, entertained her voice? Naomi sat down again, her heart racing. She hadn't meant to speak so boldly, but once the words left her mouth, she couldn't take them back. For the rest of the session, her mind buzzed. The courtroom felt different now, not as a place where she didn't belong, but as a place she could claim. Late that afternoon, as the courthouse quieted and most of the day's cases had been resolved, something unusual happened. Judge Hawthorne was called away suddenly for a private matter. The courtroom sat empty, save for a few clerks organizing files. Naomi lingered near the back, her bag still clutched tightly against her lap, and then her eyes drifted forward, to the bench. It was only a few steps away. The judge's seat, high and commanding, sat empty, its leather shining under the light, the gavel resting neatly at its side. Naomi's breath caught. Every rational part of her told her to leave, to walk away, but her legs moved anyway, one step, then another, until she stood at the base of the bench, staring up at the seat that had haunted her dreams for years. Her fingers trembled as she touched the polished wood, and then, and with no one to stop, her. She climbed the steps and sat down. For the first time in her life, Naomi Carter felt the weight of the bench beneath her, and though the courtroom was empty, the air seemed to shift, as though the walls themselves acknowledged her presence. The gavel was warm in her hand, and deep inside, Naomi knew this was only the beginning. Every case, every verdict, every shattered or saved life had passed through this very seat. To be here was to hold centuries of power, of law, of consequence. Naomi Carter closed her eyes, her fingertips brushing the handle of the gavel. For one impossible moment, she let herself imagine it was hers. Ma'am? Naomi jolted, her hand jerking away from the gavel. A clerk had re-entered the courtroom holding a stack of files. His steps froze mid-aisle as his eyes widened at the sight of her sitting in the judge's chair. Naomi stammered, heat flooding her face. She pushed herself up quickly. But the clerk surprised her. Instead of reprimanding, he tilted his head thoughtfully. You looked like you belonged there, he said quietly. Naomi blinked. What? The clerk shrugged, balancing the files against his chest. Most people who sneak up there look like children trying on their father's shoes. You didn't. You looked like you'd been waiting to sit there for a long time. His words lingered long after he left the room. Naomi stood at the side of the bench, her pulse still racing. For the first time in years, she felt less like an outsider and more like a piece of the puzzle she had been missing. That night, Naomi walked home with her mind buzzing. Yet Naomi barely saw them. She thought instead of her son, Caleb, safe with her sister for the day. He was only 6, still young enough to ask why the world treated his mother differently than others. Naomi had always answered with half-truths, shielding him from the sharpest edges of reality. But as she walked, she wondered, how long until he saw the world's cracks for himself? When she reached her small apartment, Caleb was already asleep. She kissed his forehead softly and lingered by his bed. "I'll make it better," she whispered, her promise as much to herself as to him. "One way or another, I'll make it better." The following morning, Naomi received an unexpected call. "Miss Carter?" The voice on the other end was unmistakably Judge Hawthorne's, deep, precise, controlled. Naomi straightened instinctively as though standing before him. "Yes, Your Honor?" "I'd like to speak with you," he said. "My chambers. This afternoon. 3 o'clock. Naomi's throat tightened. Am I in trouble?" A pause, then, not at all. Quite the opposite. The line went dead. Judge Hawthorne's chambers smelled faintly of old leather and polished oak. Books lined every wall, and thick volumes of case law and precedent, each spine a testament to justice both served and denied. Naomi stood stiffly at the edge of the rug as the judge gestured her forward. "Sit," he said. She obeyed, her palms damp. For a moment, Hawthorne simply studied her, his eyes searching. Finally, he leaned back. "You impressed me yesterday." Naomi blinked. "By refusing to let an officer lie about me?" A faint smile tugged his lips. "By speaking truth, by understanding what this seat requires." He tapped his desk gently. "Courage, composure, clarity." Naomi frowned. "With respect, Your Honor, I don't understand." "I don't wear a robe. I don't have a title. I'm just—" "Don't diminish yourself," Hawthorne interrupted, his voice sharp. "You've studied law. You see through the fog of arguments most lawyers drown in. And more importantly, you carry the weight of lived experience. That cannot be taught." Naomi's breath caught. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," Hawthorne said slowly, "there may come a day when you'll be asked to speak in this courtroom again. And when that happens, I want you to be ready." Naomi's heart pounded. His words felt less like encouragement and more like prophecy. A week later, Naomi returned to court. She told herself she was only observing, but deep down, she knew she was waiting. For what, she couldn't name. That morning's docket included a case that had already drawn local attention, a landlord accused of exploiting tenants with unlawful evictions. The gallery was packed, reporters scribbling in notepads. Naomi sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the defendant, a slick, suited man who smirked as though the courtroom was a stage built for him. As testimony unfolded, Naomi's chest tightened. Witnesses faltered under the landlord's lawyer's cross-examination. The defense twisted words, sowed doubt, painting struggling families as irresponsible rather than victims. Naomi's nails dug into her palm. She wanted to leap up, to object, to point out the manipulations, but she couldn't. She was no attorney here, no advocate, yet when a trembling mother on the stand whispered, "We had nowhere to go," Naomi's restraint snapped. She stood. "Objection." The words slipped out before she realized it. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Judge Hawthorne's gavel struck instantly. "Miss Carter," he said firmly, though his eyes flickered with something else. Recognition. "You are not counsel in this case." Naomi froze. Apologies, Your Honor." She sank back into her seat, cheeks burning. But something had shifted. Every eye in the courtroom was on her. And Hawthorne, despite his rebuke, hadn't dismissed her presence. By recess, whispers spread like wildfire. "Who is she?" one attorney muttered. "She used to study law," another replied. "Then why isn't she practicing?" "Something about money." Dropped out. Naomi kept her head down, but she could feel the stir. For the first time, her silence didn't make her invisible. It made her a question mark, and in the halls of power, questions were dangerous. Later that afternoon, as Naomi prepared to leave, the defense lawyer, the landlord shark in a navy suit, approached her. His smile was polished, but his eyes were cold. "You've got quite a voice," he said. "But be careful where you use it. Courtrooms don't take kindly to interruptions from spectators." Naomi met his gaze evenly. Courtrooms should care more about truth than titles. His smile didn't falter, but his voice dropped an octave. "Careful, Miss Carter. Some people don't like when outsiders challenge the order of things." Naomi's pulse quickened, but she didn't back down. Maybe the order of things deserves to be challenged. They locked eyes for a beat before he walked away, his smirk returning. That evening, as Naomi gathered her bag, Judge Hawthorne approached her quietly. "No robe, no gavel, just a man with a gravity she couldn't ignore. Walk with me," he said. They stepped into the courthouse garden, the air cool and still. Hawthorne clasped his hands behind his back. "You spoke out today," he said. Naomi flushed. "I know, I shouldn't have. I couldn't help it." "Don't apologize," Hawthorne replied. "You said what needed to be said, and the room felt it," Naomi frowned. "Then why stop me?" "Because timing matters," Hawthorne said. "Truth in the wrong moment can fall on deaf ears. But truth at the right moment? It can move mountains," Naomi's heart thudded. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Hawthorne said slowly, "that when the moment comes again, I may not be the one speaking. You might be." That night, Naomi dreamed of the courtroom, but in her dream, she wasn't in the gallery. She wasn't standing at the side. She was at the bench. The robe hung heavy on her shoulders, the gavel warm in her palm. She struck it once, and silence fell. She looked down not at strangers, but at faces she recognized, her son, her neighbors, people whose lives had been weighed by justice that wasn't just, and they were looking to her. Naomi woke with tears in her eyes, her chest rising and falling with the force of the dream. It was ridiculous, impossible. Yet the image refused to fade. A month later, the breaking point arrived. Another case. Another abuse of power. This time it wasn't a landlord. It was the very officer who had slapped Naomi weeks earlier, now on trial for misconduct against another civilian. The irony wasn't lost on her. The courtroom buzzed with tension. The officer sat stiffly at the defense table, jaw tight. His accuser, a young man with bruises still fading on his cheek, sat nervously nearby. Naomi's stomach churned. She remembered the officer's hand, the arrogance in his eyes. She remembered the sting, and when the defense tried to twist the accuser's words, suggesting he had provoked the officer, Naomi couldn't stay silent. She rose again, voice steady. "That's a lie." The room froze. This time, Judge Hawthorne didn't strike his gavel immediately. Instead, he looked at Naomi long and hard. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, "step forward." Naomi's knees nearly buckled, but she obeyed. She walked down the aisle, past the murmuring gallery, until she stood at the front of the courtroom. And then, to everyone's shock, Judge Hawthorne stood from his bench. "Take my seat." The room erupted in gasps. Naomi's breath caught. "What?" "Take my seat," Hawthorne repeated, his eyes unwavering. Naomi's hands trembled. The gavel seemed to call her again. The seat loomed like a destiny she had never dared to claim. And as she climbed the steps, her heart pounding in her chest, Naomi Carter knew there was no turning back. Naomi's fingers brushed the polished wood of the judge's bench as she sat. For a moment, she thought she might faint. The murmurs in the gallery roared like waves. The lawyers craned their necks in disbelief, and the accused officer's smugness cracked for the first time. Naomi Carter sat in the judge's seat, and the world seemed to tilt. "Order!" Judge Hawthorne barked, still standing but now beside her. His voice boomed, silencing the crowd. He turned to Naomi. His words were sharp, but his eyes were steady. "Miss Carter," he said, "you have spoken truth in this courtroom before. Today, you will help weigh it. You will ask the questions I cannot." Naomi's mouth went dry. I don't have the authority." "You have the authority of the truth," Hawthorne interrupted. "Now use it," he gestured to the gavel. Naomi's trembling hand wrapped around it. The weight anchored her. She struck it once. The sharp crack rang out, echoing like destiny. "Proceed," she said softly. The defense lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection!" This is unprecedented. This woman is not a judge, not an attorney. This is a circus. Naomi's eyes locked on him. Sit down. The words weren't shouted, but they carried. The gallery stilled. The lawyer froze. Something in her tone, conviction, clarity, left no room for argument. Slowly, unwillingly, he sat. Naomi turned her gaze to the accused officer. He sat rigid, his jaw set, but his eyes flickered with unease. Officer Daniels, Naomi said, her voice steady now. Why did you put your hands on the man who accused you? Why did you put your hands on me? Gasps rippled through the room. Hawthorne's lips twitched, but he said nothing. Daniels swallowed. Because you disrespected the badge. People like you, people like me, Naomi cut in, leaning forward. You mean people without power? People without a title? Or people with skin like mine? The silence was deafening. Daniel's throat bobbed, but no words came. Naomi pressed on. You struck me outside this very courthouse. You struck this young man, too. But the truth is, you thought you could get away with it. You thought no one would listen. You thought we were invisible. The accuser's eyes welled with tears. The gallery shifted, murmurs growing louder. Naomi lifted the gavel again, striking it down. But we are not invisible. Not anymore. For the next hour, Naomi questioned witnesses with a clarity that left even seasoned attorneys rattled. She cut through excuses, untangled lies, and gave voice to truths long ignored. The clerk scribbled furiously. The stenographer's keys clicked without pause. Even the skeptical lawyers leaned forward, begrudgingly captivated. At one point, the landlord's defense attorney from the previous case entered the gallery, curiosity drawing him back. His smirk faltered as Naomi dismantled Daniel's testimony piece by piece. This isn't the law, he muttered under his breath. No, whispered someone beside him. This is justice. Finally, Judge Hawthorne stepped forward again. He placed a hand gently on Naomi's shoulder. That is enough. Naomi's chest rose and fell, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She looked out at the room, at Daniels, at the young accuser, at the sea of faces no longer mocking but watching with reverence. Hawthorne's voice filled the chamber. This court finds Officer Daniels guilty of misconduct. The gavel in Naomi's hand struck the bench one last time, sealing the verdict. The sound thundered through her bones. When court adjourned, the gallery erupted, not with chaos but with applause. Not wild but steady like a heartbeat. Naomi sat frozen, tears pricking her eyes. She rose slowly, handing the gavel back to Judge Hawthorne. I don't know what just happened, she whispered. Hawthorne smiled faintly. History. That evening, Naomi walked the courthouse steps alone. The cool air kissed her face, but her skin still burned with the weight of what had transpired. Her son, Caleb, was waiting on the porch when she arrived home. He ran into her arms, small hands clutching her shirt. How was court, Mama? He asked. Naomi held him tighter, her heart swelling. Different, she said softly. Court was different today. She didn't tell him everything. Not yet. But she knew he'd feel the shift in her voice, in her presence. 2 days later, Naomi received another summons to Judge Hawthorne's chambers. You've shaken the walls of this courthouse, he said as she sat across from him. And the people. They listened. Naomi flushed. I didn't plan it. I just couldn't stay silent. Hawthorne leaned forward. Then don't stay silent. Finish what you started years ago. Return to law school. I will help. Naomi's eyes widened. I don't have the money. You will have a scholarship. Hawthorne interrupted. And you will have my recommendation. Naomi Carter, you belong in this fight. Tears blurred her vision. For years, she had believed her dream had withered, choked by circumstance. But here it was, revived, offered back to her like a seed waiting to be planted. She nodded, her voice breaking. Yes, I'll do it. Months later, Naomi stood once more in a courtroom. Not as a spectator, not as a trespasser in the judge's seat, but as a law student, her books heavy in her arms, her future wide open. She paused in the gallery, looking at the bench. She remembered the weight of the gavel in her hand, the silence after her words, the truth that had finally been heard, and she smiled, because one day soon, it wouldn't just be a dream. Years later, A new judge took her oath in that same courthouse. Her robe was crisp, her gavel steady. The gallery was filled with faces. Her son, grown now, proud in the front row. Her neighbors. Even Judge Hawthorne, older, watching with pride. Naomi Carter lifted her right hand and swore to uphold the truth. Not the kind twisted by power, but the kind lived by people like her. And when she sat in the judge's seat for the first time as her own, the silence that followed wasn't disbelief. It was respect.